Hello, everyone, the viewers of this webinar, which is on class struggle, on capitalism and class struggle in Syria. And it is part of a webinar series. You will find the schedule under the website, thesyrianrevolt.org. And this is the sixth webinar in the series, and there will be 12 webinars in total. Of which, for instance, the next one, so this one, as I said, is on capitalism and class struggle in Syria, and the next one on July 19th, it's titled From Syria to Mexico, the Fight for a World Without Borders. And there are other very important issues that are still being addressed. So the next webinar then on the 22nd of July will be on the struggles for Kurdish liberation in Syria and the region, and so on. You will see this. Schedule online on the Facebook page and on SyrianRevolt.org. And I am really honored to be moderating this important webinar. Also working together with our, I think, amazing speakers, which are addressing really important issues related to the political economy of the Syrian revolution, an issue that we thought is not being addressed a lot. Especially not in mainstream media, of course, but also maybe an issue that has been neglected throughout the past 10 years or the past 9 years. And so it will be important to look at the history of the Ba'ath Party related to political economy and class struggle, but also on land reform. So Jihad Yazigi will speak on the history of the Ba'ath Party and its taking power in 1963 and putting it into relation with 2011 and today. Then Miriam Ababsa will speak about land reform and counter land reform, also addressing the drought. You will see those who are not familiar with different socio-political issues on Syria will see why this famous drought needs to be addressed in a panel speaking about land reform and about class struggle. So we are happy to welcome Miriam Ababsa. Then Samer Aboud will speak about the neoliberalization, different neoliberalization policies of the state, and Yasin Haj Saleh about the privatization of the state itself, and something that he speaks of as a serious threat of famine, public famine. And so we will, of course, we will try to later then also address different questions by viewers. You can post your questions online on the Facebook page, and I can read them here so that speakers can address them, can respond to them, and also have a discussion. And I would say that I now give the microphone already to the first speaker. We are very honored for Jihad Yazigi to be the first speaker. Jihad, can I invite you to start your presentation?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thanks to you, to Yasser, to Robin, and good evening to everyone. I'm speaking from Beirut today, so I hope we will not have power cuts in the next 15 minutes while I will be speaking. So today I want to talk to you about the Syrian revolution, but not the Syrian revolution we usually we all know and we call the revolution that began in 2011, but rather the coup d'etat by the Ba'ath Party on March 8, 1963, which the Baathists actually call a revolution. To this day, you have many locations, events. You have a newspaper called Thawra that refer to that word, to the arrival to the Ba'ath in 63, to the arrival of the Ba'ath to power. On March 8, 1963, a number of officers of the Ba'ath Party and of other groups seized power in Syria. For many Syrians at the time, it was only one coup among many other coups. Since Syria's independence, there had been dozens of or so coups d'etat actually that took place. But that specific one was actually quite different because on that date, the arrival to power of the Ba'ath changed actually the history of Syria quite radically. The coup d'etat basically ended around 17 years of rule by mostly urban elites of Aleppo and Damascus, both economic and political rule. Despite the fact that there were many coups d'etat, these elites held power to a large extent throughout that period. And these elites were mostly urban elites from these two great cities. They were mostly landowners, merchants, industrialists, mostly overwhelmingly Sunnis with a big minority of Christians. And then in 1963, you have this coup that brings a radical change in the composition of the elites, both political and economic. The new elites, the new rulers, if you want, are from the countrysides or from small towns. They are from a diverse class composition. You find farmers, officers, mid-level bureaucrats. From a more diverse, also sectarian composition, you of course have Sunnis, but you also have now in power Alawites, Druze, Ismailis, which was something you wouldn't find much in Damascus, in Aleppo, and in most centers of power at the time. The coup also brought stability, relative political stability to the country. It also brought a radical change in economic policies. You had a nationalization of almost all economic sectors, the destruction of the economic power base of the previous elites, an increase in state involvement in the economy, the expansion of the health and education infrastructure, for instance, or of road and electricity networks, and so on and so forth. So that was starting March 1963. Now, during the 1970s, thanks to these policies, but also at the time to Gulf funding, then the price of oil had risen significantly. So Syria invested heavily in all its infrastructure and economy. And throughout that decade, it actually had the third highest average annual growth rate of its Human Development Index. Not the third highest HDI, the highest average annual growth rate. So a reflection, if you want, of the growth in the education level, in the provision of health services, and in the economy as a whole. One symbol of that period was the construction of the Tabqa Dam on the Euphrates River, the largest dam in Syria to this day, which had the objective, if you want, of increasing irrigated land and electrical production. In 1970, Omar Amir Alay, a late Syrian documentary filmmaker, probably one of the greatest Syrian filmmakers, made a film which glorified the dam, which talked of the engineering prowess, of the significant economic and social benefits that the dam was expected to bring. The film is short. I would advise you, I could suggest you watch it. It's 12 minutes long. It's called A Film Essay on the Euphrates Dam. Now, in the second half of the 1970s, the situation started to change. The regime was growing increasingly repressive. The corruption was rising with the big funds coming from the Gulf. You had increasingly large government contracts with a lot of corruption. And you had protest movements, Syrians taking to the streets, protesting against the Ba'ath Party and the political and the political system. People were demanding more political freedoms. They were demanding a curb on corruption. They were also opposing the regime's intervention in Lebanon, where it was basically it invaded Lebanon it entered into Lebanon to counter the PLO. Initially, these protests were led by professional unions from the main cities, lawyers, engineers, pharmacists, doctors. But later, with growing and so many of them were progressives, actually. But with growing repression by the regime, the movement changed gradually, and Islamists took the lead of the protests, mainly from Aleppo and Hama, where the Muslim Brotherhood in particular were very influential. Aleppo and Hama are interesting because they are two cities whose elite are largely land-owning elites, and are two cities that lost significantly from the arrival of the Ba'ath Party to power. During that period, the countryside remained largely on the sidelines or supported the regime in some cases. Areas or cities such as Daraa, which was so important in 2011, where the revolution began, well, in the 70s, when these protests erupted and the regime repressed them, they remained largely on the sideline. Daraa and all its region, Horan, but other parts of the country too. It's important, of course, to remember that Horan, Daraa benefited quite a lot from the Ba'ath Party in terms of investment in infrastructure, or also, for instance, enabling a lot of members of that city and of that area to gain influence. As an example, Farouk al-Sharra, some of you may know, have heard of him. He's a former Syrian foreign minister, was from Daraa, but you have a lot of other people who, acceded to power. In other words, for some time, the Ba'ath Party had a positive impact on the life of many Syrians. And I think that's something important to remember. Now, gradually, the situation started changing, growing economic difficulties, the government retreating from the economy, is investing less, spending less, and liberalizing increasingly its economy. That started around the mid-80s. Liberalization was suspended a bit in the 1990s because the government discovered oil, which increased fiscal revenues and didn't make reform urgent anymore. But then liberalization really expanded much more rapidly after the arrival to power of Bashar al-Assad. And it's interesting also to understand the arrival of Bashar al-Assad doesn't only mean more economic liberalization, but it also means the arrival of a new elite within the Ba'ath regime. The first generation of Ba'athists were officers, sons of officers, of farmers, as I was saying, of mid-level bureaucrats, grew up very often in the countryside. Bashar al-Assad and the people who came with him had a different profile. They were born in cities, in urban centers, had different networks, different interests too. And in other words, from the mid-1980s onwards until 2011, the traditional Ba'athist constituencies were left gradually aside, and the urban centers gained more influence gradually. They were nowhere close, their influence was nowhere close to what it was in the 50s, but it was different from, it was much higher in terms of influence from what it was in the 60s or 70s. In 2003, Omar Amiralay, again him, directed another film called A Flood in the Ba'ath Country. 33 years after his first film, he wanted to highlight the failure, the misery, the destruction, in many ways, the horror also brought by the Ba'athist political project. Then in 2011, as you all know, the revolution begins in Daraa, which, as I was saying, is a former Ba'athist heartland. And of course, it's important to remember that the 2011 uprising, contrary to what many are saying now, was not did not specifically begin from the countryside. Yes, the first few demonstrations began in Daraa, but it was really very wide from a geographic perspective. It was really across the country. It was very wide also across social classes, although it was less the case across sectarian groups, in particular minority group. Now, gradually, so that's how, but so again, I mean, the cities participated, in a lot of leaders of the uprising were people from the cities, but the countryside was also present. Now, gradually, with increasing regime repression, killing, torture, expulsion, and so on and so forth, with growing militarization also of the uprising, well, many left, and those that remained were those who had least to lose, actually, and it was basically the countryside. And this is why, actually, quite quickly, what we see today is that, to a large extent, the Syrian uprising, the core of the Syrian uprising has been the cities, the main cities, suburbs, and the countryside. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think you more or less know this today. But I want to highlight one or two things before concluding. First of all, in 2013, I think, a number of Syrian experts who were affiliated with the opposition published a report they called the Syrian Transition Roadmap. The idea was, if you want to produce a set of recommendations for the post-Assad Syria, any future post-Assad Syria. And the report covered a number of aspects: judiciary, politics, economy, and so on and so forth. In its economic chapter, so you had an analysis of the situation and a number of recommendations. The first economic recommendation was to return the land and all the assets that were nationalized in the 1960s to their previous owners. In other words, to the sons and grandsons of the elites of the 1940s and 50s. So of course, why is it interesting? It is interesting because this type of report highlights the diversity of the composition of the opposition. On the one hand, you have people such as those who want a return to pre-1960. But at the same time, those who wrote this report did not seem disconnected or did not realize that actually the protest began from the countryside, from poor farmers or people felt left aside, not because they wanted their lands to return to the previous elite, but because they want to preserve their land and other interests. And so, I mean, of course, our roundtable and the presentation is looking at socioeconomic aspects of Syria's history. But myself, I'm not trying to imply that you can understand everything from that lens. There are many other aspects you have to look at: the historical, sociological, sectarian, of course, geopolitical, and so on and so forth. But I think for Syrians and for those who support our struggle, the post-1963 history is a very good lesson for us to understand it's important to understand and take into account the complex set of interests that drive political movements such as ours. You have different groups with different interests. That may sound basic, but that needs to be reset, especially when, in light of the very deep divisions among the opposition, the incapacity of many Syrians to talk on key issues. And I think taking into account these lessons are really important to produce some form of minimal consensus to help us formulate a political project that eventually liberates us from that ruthless regime. Sarah, I will stop here, and I will leave the floor to other speakers. And of course, I'll be very happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Jihad. Yes, this is one of our main aims, to have a discussion afterwards, address different questions as well, and put the different presentations into relation. I also want to say that Jihad is a Syrian journalist who specializes on covering Syrian economic affairs, and he is the founder and editor of the Syria Report, and co-founder of the Syrian Observer. And has also published reports on Syria's war economy and decentralization. And I guess the issue of decentralization in relation to political economy will be something that I will ask you about later as well. And I would like to welcome now Miriam Ababsa, who, as I said, will address the issue of land reform. And I will also introduce Miriam, so that those of you who haven't read her short bio will understand what her work is and why we have invited her for this webinar. Miriam, thank you for attending. We are honored to have you as a geographer. And yeah, I would just say that you can start.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. And I would like to thank, of course, Yasser Mounif and Robin and you, Sarah, and all the team. So as a geographer, I started working on the topic of land reform and counter-agrarian reform doing my fieldwork in Syria as a PhD student from 1996 to 2003, and at a moment where I saw precisely a change, and it's very interesting, it's linked to what Jihad said, this moment where the idea after 2001 was to give back land to the former landowner expropriated in 58. So I suggest to look at these two big reform. The first 1958 land reform and agrarian reform. Then what happened in 2001. I will mention also the drought, 2008, but before the drought, and put it in the context of the modification of the agrarian reform law. So it's important to remember that together with Turkey, Syria had the most productive agricultural sector in the Middle East in total figure, and was self-sufficient from 91 until 2008. Syria total arable land are of 8 million hectares, 1.2 million of which is irrigated, 1.5 million hectares are cultivated with wheat, and 1.3 million with barley, for a total production of 4.5 million tons of wheat before the war. So this, before the war, agriculture was highly subsidized and counted for 1/3 of the gross domestic product and employed 1/3 of the working population. And this is the result of several structural agrarian reform, land distribution, that occurred between 58 and 2008. Of course, we all know that the agrarian reform law in Syria was adopted during the short United Arab Republic, and it was inspired by the Nasserist reform. At this time, 3/4 of the peasants had only very small parcel or were landless. Just to give you an idea, in 51, 90% of the Jazeera land was owned by only 14 Bedouin chiefs and town notables. So this agrarian reform law was a key policy to abolish unequal production relations, increase the production, and allow the development of the Arab socialism conceived by Salah Pitar and Michel Aflaq as an ideal regime which will allow to express the genius of the Arab people. Okay. In fact, the agrarian reform became the means for successive Ba'athist regime to build up a new political base by endowing the peasant with land and favoring medium and small land owners. And in fact, what is interesting is that it was associated with a wave of nationalization, which aimed at removing the notable city dwellers from the political life. Of course, as we mentioned, the idea was to attain self-sufficiency, to counter the West, but also to build an old legitimacy among former poor peasants and sharecroppers. I will not enter in the detail, it's a bit technical, but the idea is to put a cap to the property you can own, to 80 hectares in irrigated and planted land. And then it was modified in 61 under the pressure of the landed aristocracy, and the ceiling were raised to 200 hectares of irrigated land. The work has been highly studied by Bashar Khader, Raymond Hinbush, Hannah Batatu. You have a lot of references, and Suleiman Khalaf from Raqqa has described the sociological change that it occurred. It apports. Yes, it's brief. Okay. What is interesting is that if we go in detail, we look at, it's not about only land distribution. It's about the implementation of the first agrarian relation law, Law 134 of 1958. For the first time, tenancy contracts were written and automatically renewed, even in the event of the change of ownership due to sale of the land. According to this law, tenants who only work the land without providing seed or fertilizer were entitled to at least 25% of irrigated cotton harvest, 33% of irrigated vegetable harvest, 40% of unirrigated vegetable harvest. In fact, the application of the law of the land relation has allowed peasants and tenants to enjoy a significant increase in income. As Suleiman Khalaf have shown, in Raqqa, for instance, the average share of crop that went to the farmer rose by 20 to 30% to reach almost 43%. And this enrichment was a prelude to a significant transformation of social relations in the Syrian countryside as a result of the reduction of farmer debts to landowners. Moreover, tenant farmers had the opportunity of obtaining new form of credit outside of the context of feudal land owners. Of course, state farms were created along as a result of the successive land reform in 58, 63, 66, and 5-year plans had this objective of self-sufficiency. Of course, the government subsidized all inputs, seeds, fertilizer, fuel, was the sole buyer of wheat, and controlled all marketing channels during the Syria development trajectory. So what happened? Basically, what is interesting is to see that, in fact, in detail, the land reform and land distribution was not totally implemented for political reasons. It was very pragmatic. The idea from the 70s was to let, not to expropriate the largest, the biggest landowner. For instance, in Al Jazeera, so Raqqa, Hasakeh, Deir ez-Zor, only 1/3 of the land who needed to be expropriated were expropriated. The idea was that the Ba'ath regime wanted to keep some industrialists able to create, let's say, an agro-industrial sector out of the production. Well, it was developed very, very late. But it was in 2004 to have the first cotton ginning industry in Raqqa, for instance. So it's very late. Everything was controlled by Aleppo, was sent to Aleppo. Anyway, so first, and one of the reasons, of course, is obvious, is that you had no land registration. Only 13% of the land was properly registered, and this is also political. Second, techniques were done to distribute the land to the heirs, so to fragment all the big properties and latifundia. So in that context, I come now to the 2000-2001 counter-reform decision. So between December 2000 and December 2001, the Syrian Ba'ath Party promulgated a series of political decisions, takarir, that aim at privatizing the state farm in Syria. The main one is decision number 83 of 16 December 2000. It put an end to 43 years of collectivist experiment in the field of land reform, including 38 years under the aegis of the Ba'ath Party. So what was the main idea? The land of the state farm was parceled out in share of 3 hectares for irrigated land and 8 hectares for non-irrigated land. And right of use and not property of this land was given by order of priority to the former owner that were expropriated in 58, to the farm workers, to the employee of the general administration of the Euphrates Basin, and then to all citizens and all civil servants who wanted to retire. And this decision triggered considerable tension and competition among all these categories, each sphere being excluded from the land redistribution process. I will not enter in detail, but what did we see in Raqqa? We saw land resale and the recreation of latifundia by contractor on the Euphrates, benefiting from the water from the dam and the Assad dam and all the subsidized water. So in fact, and because at the same time you had a destructuration of the cooperatives to reach fertilizer and seeds. So the person who received the beneficiaries were not able to really develop the land, and they started to sell or rent those lands. It's really interesting because it happened in Syria between 2001 2004, 10 years after a similar process was implemented in Egypt by the reform 92 that was implemented in 96 and that pushed 1.5 million peasants and especially women sharecroppers to the city, to the informal areas. And this was studied by Ray Bush. Okay. So this is the context, general context in which the drought occurred in the same region, in the Jazeera. So what did we saw? The state farm privatization process constituted an unexpected counter-revolution. Indeed, the primary beneficiary of the reform process are not the traditional rural constituent of the Ba'ath Party, but a re-emergent class of latifundists tied to central state and traditional power structure. In parallel, I would like to mention what happened in 2004, just before the 2008 drought. As we know all, Syria was hit by a severe drought in 2006-2010. For the first time in history, the country had to receive international aid and food supplies for 1 million farmers, herders, and their family. But even before the drought, Samir Aita, the economist, showed that Syria, between 2002 and 2008, had already lost 40% of its agricultural workforce, which dropped from 1.4 million to 800,000 persons because of mismanagement of water and land resources. From first point. A second point, an important new agrarian relation law, Law 56 of 2004, was adopted to terminate, to allow all landowners to terminate farming contracts. So this is totally the end of all the land reform and the agrarian relation law we saw in 58. This law was highly contested. It's very highly capitalist, anti-socialist, and it favored landowner again. In that context, this law allowed to terminate after 3 years all tenancy contracts and replace them with temporary 1-year contracts. And the work was very interesting work was conducted by Diana Sarkis Fernandez in Tartus and Latakia, for instance. It led to the expulsion of tenants and workers. And also another context that's really important for the drought is that the drought consequences were exacerbated by the rise in fodder prices worldwide and by the government decision to stop subsidizing fuel in 2008. And this is all over the Middle East during the same in Jordan. And so at this moment in January 2008, bread and fodder prices increased by 75%. Fuel prices rose by 257%. That means from 7 Syrian pounds a liter to 25. And this had a very strong impact on middle-sized farmers who were using motor pump to extract water to irrigate the fields and to run tractors. And this situation got even worse for the middle shepherd who used to drive water tanks to their flocks and graze anywhere in the Badia. So I wanted to just shed a light on this series of decisions that had a large impact of millions of farmers and inhabitants in the northeast Syria that created a social, along with the world economic crisis, that created a context of fragility, preluding to of course, the civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam, for this great presentation. I also want to introduce Miriam shortly, who is a French-Algerian social geographer based in Jordan. And she is associate researcher at the French Institute for the Near East. And she has received also the Syrian Studies Association Best Doctoral Dissertation Prize and is author of Raqqa, it's French, Territoire et pratique sociale d'une ville syrienne,
Bravo.
if I got that right. Thank you so much, Miriam. I have some questions prepared already, and so we will, I think, have an interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you. And now our next speaker is Samer Aboud. And we welcome Summer, and I would say you start your presentation, and as with the others, I'll introduce you afterwards. Thank you, Summer.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Yasser, Robin, everyone else involved. It's a real honor to be a part of this. I hope that one day maybe we can do it again in person. So my presentation really picks up a lot from where some key points in Jihad and Mariam's presentation. I'm specifically interested in this period of the late 90s and through to the 2000s. So what I'm interested in about this period is how sort of the process of state transformation that begins in the 90s, accelerates in the 2000s, that seeks to reorient the relationship between the state and the economy, between private capital and the public sector, between the private sector and the public sector, and of course between citizens and the state and citizens and markets. I really want to make 2 points for the sake of discussion and hopefully 2 important takeaways here. The first, and this is to reinforce, I think, a bit what Jihad and Miriam were saying, that the process of state transformation that was initiated by the regime sought to intentionally reverse the inclusion of the groups that Jihad was talking about from the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. So it sought to reverse the process through which those groups were politically and materially linked to the state through something that I'm calling marketization. And the second point that I want to make is that marketization, the kind of flip of that process, is that marketization provides the conditions for absorbing private capital, not only into the economy, but into the logic of regime rule, to the logic of regime power, and of course, and the logic of state intervention into the economy. So the process of state transformation that I'm interested in has its kind of genesis in the 1980s and the years of economic stagnation that followed, notwithstanding this oil blip that Jihad talked about. In the 80s and 90s, this kind of process of stagnation begins to force a recalculation of the regime's relationship to private capital. So a gradual reform process begins that in theory attempts to shift development responsibility to the private sector. But this process in reality was very limited, it was circumscribed, and it was concentrated in very particular sectors of the economy. So it did not actually lead to serious structural changes or a kind of serious reorientation of the state and its institutions. But by the 90s and 2000s, there's momentum from within the party itself for a much deeper liberalization of the economy. So kind of move beyond reform. This manifests very interestingly in Syria in a kind of discursive landscape. So Syrian economists start writing about and thinking about what model of development the country should pursue. And so there's discussion of the China model, the Dubai model, the Singapore model, these sorts of things. There are also technical discussions about how best to pursue economic reform. So which sectors should be targeted, how they should be targeted. These discussions are interesting in and of themselves, but they're also interesting because they intertwine with this kind of adoption of neoliberal language as a diagnosis for the Syrian economy. And what's interesting about this is that this happens independent of any direct IMF or World Bank financial intervention into Syria. There's instead a process of IMF and World Bank influence in Syria. And we see this through a number of workshops, relationships that develop between state officials and officials from the World Bank and IMF. So if you think of the labor law that was passed in 2010 that I'll talk about in a second, this came after 4 years of workshops and consultations. The public-private partnership law that comes in 2010, it's the same thing. So there is not the direct kind of financial pressure or conditionality that's imposed on Syria, but there is this influence of kind of neoliberal diagnosis of the economy that comes from outside, and it is very much internalized and given kind of meaning in the Syrian context. I'm going to refer to that or come back to that in a minute. So this process of stagnation, a change in party leadership, and renewed debate about the economy produced momentum towards what I'm calling here marketization. The patterns of marketization during the 2000s were gradual, but they ultimately produced a really substantive transformation of the state. I would identify 5 principles for the sake of discussion. 5 principles behind, or 5 elements of marketization in Syria during this period. The first is a very slow privatization of services that occurs through a delegation of responsibility to the charity sector, to the NGOs, to the private sector as a whole. The second element, which is related, was a restructuring of state enterprises around the logic of the market. State enterprises were not sold off. This was not a kind of privatization through a sale of public, at least not initially, but rather there was an attempt to impose or to restructure state institutions around principles of managerialism, flexibility, to impose deregulation, and so on. So there were these new laws that were passed that changed the relationship between public sector institutions, or managers and the institutions, managers and labor. The third point is that there was an expansion of private sector markets to facilitate the penetration of regional and domestic capital in areas that had been previously protected. So banking, insurance, real estate, Miriam and Jihad alluded to some of the other areas as well. The fourth was this process of price decontrols that was really accelerated in 2004 with the passing of decree, I think 2908, and this imposed, this eliminated price ceilings of basic goods. It changed the classification of goods according to basic, necessary, and luxury, I think. Anyways, there's a reclassification of goods and an attempt to eliminate price ceilings and to impose the market rationality on pricing. And of course, price ceilings were a form of social protection, and the subject of prices to the market mechanism was very limited prior to this. But this process was very, very uneven. So there were slow decontrols that were then rolled back and then accelerated. Miriam talked about the fuel prices. There was a comparable rise in food prices in 2005, between 2005 and 2006, where food prices on average went up 50%. So the government intervened again. But so the process was not complete, and it created a series of problems throughout the decade. The fifth element of marketization was this general desire to create a new economic subject and to change the relationship between Syrians, between Syrian citizens and the market. And this was this attempt to kind of position Syrians as consumers and to change the kind of logic of state intervention and to alleviate. I mean, if you look at the language of state officials and their declarations during the 2000s, there's this kind of ambiguous goal of eliminating subsidies, eliminating price ceilings by 2010 so that the citizen can kind of function on their own. And so there's a very interesting kind of discourse that emerges in this period that is about encouraging Syrians to act like market citizens. So marketization in Syria was deployed not as a process, not as a strategy of reform, but as an instrument of state formation in which state power was reorganized throughout the economy in order to bring about the changes that I was referring to earlier. It was not simply the diminishing of state power, but its reorientation in fulfillment of a renewed Ba'athist state-building project that brought together marketization and regime stability. I think this is very important. Both party and state had to be reoriented around the market, but the reorientation had to be consistent with the policies and the politics of the previous decades of Ba'athist rule. Couldn't be seen as abandoning this kind of decades of state building from the 60s into the 90s. And so for this reason and reasons of regime stability, the process was very gradual. But what's interesting is not its speed. What's actually interesting is the kind of implicit political decision that's made to tether regime stability and marketization. There's a sort of desire, a sort of acknowledgement, of the desire that stability in the country, regime stability, could be achieved through a process of marketization that involved absorbing private capital interests into the state, but also through the severance of the political and material relationships with the groups that Jihad was talking about that were kind of incorporated into the state after the 60s and 70s. So there's a dual process of exclusion and inclusion happening at the level of the state in relation to the different social groups in Syria. On the one hand, a reorientation of the state around market principles severs the fiscal mechanisms linking state and society, especially in relation to prices and subsidies. Of course, that severance is very gradual. On the other hand, the increasing openness of this period that I'm talking about provides for the public, very public, and political incorporation of business people into the new economy. We see examples of this throughout the decade preceding the 2011 uprising. We see new entrepreneurial organizations popping up, new very visible networks of clerics and business people. The holding companies are all of a sudden by 2008, 2009, taking on big infrastructural projects. And there's generally a public presence of business people that had perhaps been unthinkable for some people prior to that decade. This project of state transformation is cemented in a 2005 declaration at the Ba'ath Party's 10th Regional Congress, the Declaration of the Social Market Economy. The social market economy was never given specific meaning. It was just the slogan. There's a lot of sloganeering that happened around this. But the basic idea of the model was that Syria would pursue development that would achieve social protections through market mechanisms. This was the balance, that there was an acknowledgement that marketization could have ill effects and that the purpose of state intervention into the economy was to mitigate against those effects. The problem was that while the state had been sufficiently reorienting or moving towards opening up to private capital, there was an insufficient effort to protect against the social effects of these processes. So in other words, while the regime was pursuing a marketization of the economy and leaving Syrians at the mercy of the market, the structural mechanisms needed to ensure protections from the social effects of a changing economy were never materialized. Instead, the state relied on, as you had referred a bit to this, the state relied on a series of kind of temporary or relief measures, one-time salary payments to public sector workers, a reissuing of subsidies. Some people were given like fuel coupons, so they would get a certain price for a certain amount of months. But again, there was this bigger project to end all of this by 2010. So to conclude, the transformation of the Syrian state during the 2000s occurred through a process that I'm calling here marketization. In pursuing this project, the regime sought to incorporate new and old, as Miriam reminded us, new and old elements of the private sector into the state in order to make room for private capital to penetrate the economy. And it did so while trying to cultivate a new consumer subject who would access services through the private sector. These measures did indeed lead to significant economic changes in Syria. Of course, nobody would dispute that. But they did so while simultaneously abandoning many of the policies that had supported social protections in Syria. Marketization thus produced the conditions for gradually deteriorating social situation in the country, as well as the transformation of the regime's base of support away from these classes and these groups that Jihad had talked about to a much more narrow group of private capital or private sector interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samer. I am just thinking that all speakers are really finishing on time. I also would like to introduce Samer, who is an associate professor of global interdisciplinary studies at Villanova University and co-coordinator together with Omar Dahi, who is also a speaker, I think, of one of the webinars in this webinar series. Co-coordinator of the Critical Security Studies in the Arab World Working Group of the Arab Council for Social Sciences. And Samer is also the author of Syria, together with Benjamin Muller of Syria, published in Polity in 2018, and also of Rethinking Hizbut Authority, Legitimacy and Violence, published in 2012. Thank you, Samer, for a great presentation of what we can maybe call market fundamentalism or not. We will address this question later in the discussion. And your topic, of course, of neoliberalization and market policies is very much related to Yasin Haj Saleh's presentation now. So I would like to welcome Yasin. Thank you for being here. Again, we are very honored to have you here, Yasin. And so you will speak about the privatization of the state, also in relation to a serious threat of famine, and you will explain this issue in relation to the topic. So yes, thank you, Yasin, for being here. And I would say you can start then.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So my talk will focus on the privatized state in Syria and the imminent public famine. I'm talking about public famine because according to a recent estimation by the UN, around 90% of the Syrian population live under poverty line up to US$ a day, with 9,300,000 of them in need of food assistance and 1,400,000 suffer from basic nutritional shortages. So at this juncture, it is not exaggeration with these numbers in mind to talk about an imminent famine threat in Syria. It may even be imperative to ring bells, actually. It is quite a dangerous situation. I would say here that the imminent famine is a public starvation. So it is, there are actors, there are agents behind this. And it is a continuation of the democide, which means killing. It is a concept that was coined by R.G. Rommel to represent killing people by the government or murdering, mass murder by government. So it is a continuation. This starvation is a continuation of democide going in Syria for almost a decade now. Continuation by other means, of course, by means of economy and resources and food needs. Severe poverty is by no means a new condition in Syria. The process of pauperization has been progressing from times preceding the Syrian revolution. Jihad and Samir gave some glimpses that it started maybe in 1980s and through 1990s, and then after Bashar came to power or inherited power from his father. Though it has been, of course, the pauperization process has been intensified in the last decade. The regime and its protectors blame social hardships on Western sanctions, the last of which, as you know, is the American Caesar's law. For those who don't know what is it, Caesar was cameraman in the Syrian military police, and he was able to smuggle 55,000 very horrible photos of thousands of people killed under torture. It is a big issue in Syria. Many families knew about their beloved ones from these photos. So there is an American law in effect for almost 4 weeks now to sanction the regime, and it is. I'll not go into detail. It is mostly to effect sort of political transition and maybe to change the regime's behavior in relation to Iran. Mostly, it is not about the killing machine of the regime or about the huge fortunes that were amassed by the cronies of the regime. So I think this is circumstantially true that the Western sanctions are at least partly responsible of the hardships today, but it is just aggravating a pre-existing dynamic of comprehensive impoverishment. In 27, according to another UN report, 37% of the Syrian population were under poverty line. The percentage rose steeply after the revolution to reach as high as 80% in 2018. Now, as I started, according to a new UN estimate, it is 90%. Many tend to link the dynamic of impoverishment to the process of a new liberalization of the Syrian economy in the early years of Bashar's rules, especially after 2000. And you know that in 2000 there was a Ba'ath Party Congress, and they took a decision to transform the Syrian economy to what was called at that time social market economy. It was sort of neoliberalization in a way. But I would argue actually that it is rather related to what should be called state privatization, or to privatize the state for the Assad family and its cronies. It is a process identical with the political history of the Syria under Hafez al-Assad rule for 30 years. Those Syrians who live in this period know how the state and its institutions were really privatized to serve the interests of the family of Hafez al-Assad and of his the family and their cronies. Inheritance of power to his son in 2000 is only a culmination of a state privatization guarded by highly sectarianized security function, supported in turn by elite military formations equally sectarianized. In another reductionist social analysis, I think we have to find, to answer to the question of sectarianization. We shouldn't accept a reductionist analysis that see it only a false or a guise or a mask on the face of class polarization. It has sort of autonomy. Well, the other, so we have privatization of the state. There's another phase of this privatization, which is absolute political poverty of the population. By political poverty, I mean denying people rights to talk about public issues and gathering in public spaces. So it's about talk and about gathering in public spaces, or even indeed in private spaces, as the fate of Damascus Spring showed. Damascus Spring was a short period, almost a year of political thaw, where people were able to gather in homes, in private houses, in dozens or few hundreds, and talk about public issues. So it was about owning politics. In the previous decades, I mean, in 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, many political organizations were destroyed, with high majority of their members arrested, tortured, and jailed for long years. In absence of popular organizations, independent trade unions, and they were dissolved in 1980 because they protested against the regime in those days, and they issued statements for political change, for rule of law, and for democratic freedoms. So in absence of popular organizations, independent trade unions, and free expression, the regime cronies were able to amass huge fortunes. What were called al-Mas'ulin, or the sons of the high officials of the regime, at the turn of the century, were the leading sector in freeing the Syrian economy in the first decade of the century. Bashar is one of them, only one of those, or the son of the big boss. His cousin Rami is, or was one, because now there is heated struggle between the Assad. It seems that between the Assad family and Makhlouf family for the millions and billions. The sons of Tlas and Khaddam, Tlas was the defense minister for more than 30 years, and Khaddam was the president deputy, and before he was foreign minister, were among them, among those al-Mas'ulin, or the sons of high officials. They were in their 30s at the beginning of the century. They are in their 50s now. They are, well, co-generationists of Bashar al-Assad. Things became visible in the years of Bashar, poverty and wealth alike. I mean, everything became more visible. Poverty was by no means a matter of lack of resources. It was precisely a matter of monopoly of public resources to the benefit of a new state bourgeoisie. Actually, the history of the Ba'athist rule in 67 years now is the appearance of a new class, very ferocious, with a high fascist potential, as I said in a previous webinar, and with aristocratic elements about it. I'll come back to this point in a minute. So this is a structural pattern. It is not lack of resources. Even now, it is not the lack of resources. People just cannot buy, they don't have income to guarantee, to secure their basic needs. This is a structural pattern against which to understand the present situation itself. The fact that social struggle took extremely violent forms in Syria is strongly connected to the emergence of a privileged class, sort of aristocratic state, bourgeoisie, that conceives itself as superior to those it rules. Those ruled are referred to as subaltern status. Even with this aristocracy have sort of a mission civilisatrice that is called, at time is called modernization, and at time is called secularism. By the way, never a regime spokesperson used secularism in public debate. Bashar al-Assad used it during the revolution in the context of labeling the revolution as a war against terror. The revolution erupted against appropriation of public resources, central among which is the state itself. Here, I mean, from the perspective of the state as a public resource, political poverty and economic poverty converge. It was instinctively clear to many Syrians that appropriating politics, which means appropriating assembly or gathering and talk, is one big condition for expropriating the expropriators, according to a formula by Marx in the Capital. Demonstrations were precisely popular efforts to own politics. I mean, what were the peaceful demonstrations? They were gathering of people in public spaces talking about public issues. So it was about owning politics. The expropriators resorted, as we know, to war and to protect their extreme privileges. Before the revolution, Assad Syria was a torture state, and now it is war is a continuation of its systematic torture. This point about torture is very important in my opinion, and it is not really dealt with in a satisfactory way. Hopefully, there will be more work on this. Here are two examples to show weaponization of food and basic needs in the regime torturous war. In 2012, and of course this shows also how much economy is political in Syria. In 2012, the regime war planes targeted people queuing in front of bakeries in Hama and Aleppo districts. Halfaya massacre in September 2012, where at least 93 people were killed. Some estimated the number of around 300, was the most infamous among these attacks, many attacks indeed, from the sky by warplanes. The even more killing example is the siege operations of many regions: Madaya, Zabadani, Yarmouk, refugee camp, Eastern Ghouta, Eastern Aleppo. These regions were sieged, bombed with bar bombs and other weapons, and starved. There was even a brief and rhyming slogan to epitomize the nihilist mission of the siege: "Al-Ju' aw Ruku'," which means starvation or obedience. What I want to say is that the looming famine today is starvation, and that it should be seen as an extreme practice of social war that the internal First World has been waging against the rebellious internal Third World. Do I have time? So, barrel bombs, chemical massacres, rapes, torture, and murdering people in jails, in jails and security dungeons should be perceived as modes of social struggle adopted by an extremist class whose ideology is the state. There's an important point as well, I think. I mean, there's no mistake. I mean, yes, the state is the ideology of this this class to give it sort of a public role. In some of my work, I discriminated between outer state, which is pan-Syrian and but without power, devoid completely of power, and inner state, which is the real seat of power, and it is run by this class with a high sectarian and familial thing about it as well. To conclude, the famine threat is a continuation of the starvation as a method of social war. What the latter aims the aim of the war is the perpetuation of the system of absolute political poverty. So the analytical starting point should be the process of political starvation as the best atmosphere for primitive accumulation. I talked about also in the previous webinar, from which we move to starvation as a weapon of war, then to the present famine threat. What can be built on this politically is that expropriating the state from the expropriators is the first step towards owning politics, which is precondition for avoiding famines, according to a well-known theory by Amartya Sen. This is opposite to the approach of developmental studies, where it is postulated that economic development leads to political opening. I think I have to leave it here. I'll be happy to take questions about it.
Thank you, Yasin. So there are many questions I see now in the chat, people posting questions already, the viewers, and I hope that we will be able to address all of them or maybe most of them. I also would like to introduce Yasin shortly. Yasin was also part of the second webinar in this series, which was on imperialism and anti-imperialism related to Syria, the question of imperialism and anti-imperialism. And he is a writer, former political prisoner. He served 16 years in prison between 1980 and 1996, and author of 7 books on Syria, on prison, on contemporary Islam and culture, and also founding member of Al-Jumhuriya Net and Hamish, the Syrian cultural house in Istanbul. And he is the husband of the former political prisoner Samira al-Khalil, who has disappeared, so-called disappeared, in Douma in late 2013, which is now almost 7 years ago. Thank you, Yasin. I think that the presentations really completed each other. Of course, the themes are broad, and we try to address them as much as possible in detail. And at the same time, we have restrictions regarding time. So we will see how we can proceed. There are several questions now by the audience. I am just thinking now, what is the best, how can we start best? And I think that maybe we can start, I have several questions, but we can start with a question by Daniel Neep, I think, that he addressed to Miriam. Thank you, Miriam.
Yes, so no, I put the reference about this paper. It's by Diana Sarkis Fernandez. It's in Spanish. El contrato es la ley, Estado es economía y políticas de la responsabilidad en la agricultura siria. Okay, so it's online. Okay, so the other question you asked was about was a drought real the context as a justification of. So what was the question? I want to look at it. Excuse me. I don't look at the question precisely. Oh. Sorry. excuse me. The drought in the mid-2000s is usually used to justify the failure.
Yeah, can I ask it? Can I ask it again?
Yes, please.
Yeah, can I ask the question? Okay, thank you, Miriam. So the question was the drought in the mid-2000s, that it is usually used by some people, by some fractions, to justify the failures of the Syrian economy and explain the revolt. And by so doing, they claim that Assad is not really responsible for the failures. So they use the drought as a justification or a rationalization model that, natural circumstances have caused the revolt. And we actually would like to know how you understand that.
Well, no, it's really, it's not really, it's too quick. It's too quick to go like that. Because in fact, you have, as I mentioned, you have, let's say, two structural problems. You have a structural economical problem, the fact that the politic of subsidizing cotton production was super important, because the cotton production in Syria, in the Jazeera, led to the use of 1/3 of all the water in the country. And the exploitation of underground water by mismanagement of the water, by, let's say, illegal wells, the multiplicity of wells, this created, as I mentioned, in fact, we had drought already in Syria, and the country was able to cope with that since centuries. But what was new this time is the overexploitation of water, because the government subsidized by $200, I remember the ton, cotton, and was pushing. You have a plan, to produce cotton. So this is the first mistake. Second mistake, of course, I mentioned the agrarian reform law 2004 that led to the forced renewal of all the share contract, and the fact that a lot lost their means of existence, of course. Yes, so all goes together. You had, of course, a demographic growth, and the fact that the economic model was not efficient anymore. So it's not just a drought that can explain and can cover up for decades of mismanagement and, of course, corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like, there are many questions that we could ask Miriam. Maybe we can now also ask a question to Jihad, first speaker, for those who maybe joined later. And it is related to decentralization, because Jihad, you worked a lot about the issue of decentralization strategies of the Baathist state. And it is not always easy for people who are not, well versed in the field of political economy, for instance, to understand what these decentralization strategies mean in relation to capitalist policies or political economy or socioeconomic questions in a broader sense. Now, this question is very big, but I guess you might be able to address it briefly so that others understand the broader theme of decentralization related to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, let me first correct you. I did not do big work on decentralization. I'm certainly not a specialist of the subject. I did write a number of pieces, but I'm not a specialist. In any case, there has been no decentralization policies from the Syrian government to speak of. I mean, you have a law on decentralization, or rather on local administration, passed a few years ago, but it doesn't really, it doesn't lead anywhere when it comes to decentralization. The issue itself, unfortunately, the issue of decentralization is, debating it is extremely toxic among Syrians for reasons that are not clear. I mean, there are explanations to that, but I mean, even if you were to talk of among a lot of people in the opposition, a lot of intellectuals, you have difficulties addressing the issues, except for the Kurds, who are calling for more autonomy. The issue is unfortunately rarely debated. The central government hasn't offered anything on the subject, and there isn't much production on it from Syrians, at least on that. Now, in Syria, the question actually of decentralization is very much linked, has very important socio and very important economic aspect, because of the concentration of natural resources in the northeast of the country, east of the Euphrates River, particularly. 80% of oil production, for instance, is there. More than 2/3 of wheat of the wheat crop is usually in that area. And at the end of the day, any form of decentralization process in Syria is going to require a debate on the allocation of resources and how you share these resources. They're not the only one. I mean, you don't share only natural resources, of course, but that would be the angle, one of the angles through which the debate is going to open in Syria. But I can't see much going on, to be honest, at the moment. And as I told you, I think what is important today is to open the debate on it, more than to provide answers, particularly among Syrians who remain very, very wary of the question. But it's a big subject, really, and I'm sure we can't address it now in a few minutes.
Thank you, Jihad. I would like to ask Yasin actually the same question that I asked Miriam, just because I remembered that we had a conversation on that, on the drought and its role. Yasin, would you like to address the question of the drought and how it's used as a rationalization model?
Yeah. It happens as well that I am from Al Jazeera, from this region, from Tel Aviv, or a tiny village close to Tel Aviv. So Al Jazeera was, according also to another report by the UN, if I remember well, it was 2008 or 2009, the most poor region in the country is Eastern Aleppo, then Al Jazeera region. The percentage of people under poverty line were there. We perceive as someone, as an activist from that region, many activists called Al Jazeera internal colony. It is like Sicily in Italy, according to, as you know, Gramsci's analysis. It is exploited. Cotton, Miriam talked about cotton and wheat and many crops, water and oil, of course. It is extremely exploited. It is underrepresented politically. And it is, I'm sorry to say as well, there's sort of despised, of thought of inferior, rural, half Bedouin, Shawaya. This is half Bedouin in a way. So it is really internal colony, and this of course have a bigger role than draft, because as Miriam said, draft is not something very exceptional in Syria. It happens from time to time. But the accumulated effect of colonizing the region, many people, 1,300,000 were affected by the draft and worked either in the coastal region or in Lebanon or some in Jordan. Let me just add one element, that the Syrian revolution didn't start in Al Jazeera. It started in Daraa, where there was no draft at all. So apart from this theory of draft denies the agency of Syrians, it actually it doesn't say anything why the revolution started from Daraa. I think the idea of internal colony deserve also more work on it.
Thank you, Yasin. So there are several questions raised by the audience, as I said, and I would like to maybe continue now with Jamal Mansour's question. If you want me to read it loud, I think it is Yes, it is addressed to Samer and Yassin. Maybe Samer, you can start. I will just read it loud. Given the duality of mass displacement of almost half the pre-war Syrian population and the global decline of the global left, so the traditional champion of the class struggle-based politics, how can Syrians manage to re-inject class struggle in a more defined manner into their socio-political struggle for freedom? How can they overcome the lack of physical presence and therefore possibly the possibility for mobilization on their own land, as well as the absence of I don't know if it of meaning. Yeah.
Sarah, do you want me to start?
Yes, please, Samer.
Okay. Thank you, Jamal. That's my son's middle name. It's a beautiful name. I love that name. I will say I should start by saying that I'm not Syrian, so I should not. I hesitate to answer the question, so I want my answer to be cautious and to be prefaced with that. I think that's something that I, of course, can comment on, but I would defer to Yassin and Jihad and Yasser on that question. What I will say, sort of in reference to the goal of the panel, is that one of the reasons that I think many people on the left have not had solidarity with Syrians that we would expect is that their reading of the regime and the regimes and the political economy of Syria under the regime was very different than what was presented today. So I think that's really important, although it may not seem that important to be talking about what happened prior to the conflict, given what's happened over the last decade. I do think it's important to changing the historical narrative, or to reinscribing the historical narrative with some of the discussion that we're talking about today. The other point that I want to make is that when the last time I had spoken to people who are coming in and out of Syria, it is, you're completely right. The question is a good one, that there are many Syrians who are outside now, who are trying to have a say or to express themselves politically. And of course, that's very difficult being outside of the country. But there are many people who are coming in and out, who have good politics, who have been able to go in. And they're, I mean, I personally don't see them necessarily as, apologists or anything like that. These are people who I think have really good politics and who are on the inside, coming back and forth. Of course, they're a minority, but I do think that that's happening. But I'll defer to the bigger questions. I'll defer the bigger questions to Yassin and Jihad on that.
Thank you. Maybe Jihad, you can go first. Okay, yeah, Yassin and then Jihad. Thank you.
What was the question?
Okay. So the question is long, but it's really
what was the main point? Yeah. Thank you for. Yeah, I can read it now. Well, maybe we should just introduce more complex analysis about the situation in Syria. My observation in the last decade that our comrades in the left and the West knows almost nothing at all about Syria. Nothing at all. They remember actually something about the Cold War, and Syria is still perceived within this framework, which is extremely misleading, which is, well, even in those days, it was not a great thing. I mean, so I'll not go into this. So the main thing to Jamal's, to my friend Jamal's question is that maybe we introduce complex analysis, and I think we are already in this process. I don't feel actually any inferiority complex about those who even were able to accuse us of agents of imperialism, or I was accused of being a CIA agent myself. I mean, we are owning our cause. We are developing and improving our appropriating our cause, and developing hopefully more in-depth and more complicated, more complex framework of analysis. And this is a long-run battle. I don't see that the leftists anywhere in the world, in Europe, in the US, wherever, are in a very good shape. So maybe we can, and our cause, which is the biggest struggle in the 21st century so far, maybe it can re-inject, to use your term, Jamal, sort of a new fresh thought and understanding of the world. Because Syria is, in a way, Syria is a world with 5 occupations, with many sub-state actors. So we are a world. The world is in Syria, and we are Syrians are in the world. So our cause can really be have that potential of renewing and re-injecting new ideas and new ways of thinking in a better future of the world.
Thank you, Yassin. I really wanted to also ask the same question to Jihad, but I think because of the time restrictions, maybe we can move to the next question posted by Sosan. So he asked Jihad. He says, Jihad spoke about the Syrian difficulties to communicate and organize. Do you think that Syrian pro-democracy diaspora can organize elections to vote democratically for their representatives? Jihad, would you like to answer this question?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Sausan. It's interesting you ask this question, because actually towards the end of last year, or rather in the fall of last year, we had this discussion with a group of friends in Paris. I live myself in Paris, about organizing elections for the Syrian diaspora, but it was very much at the initial stage, and the discussion did not move forward because of the difficulties that Syrians face of all kinds, really, material related to their residency issue, the struggle of all of us face in our daily lives. But to answer your question, I think this is a very interesting option to look at. Looking at it is also a way to re-inject a dynamism within the Syrian diaspora, to re-energize a lot of Syrians who are abroad. I'm not sure the process can go ahead, but thinking about it and working on it is a very good idea. There are Syrians across the world. They are amazingly not represented in any manner by anyone. There is no political force representing them. So why not organizing? I mean, this is a call. This is an open call. Actually, I thank you, Sausan, for this question. I invite all of you who think this is an interesting idea and question to think about it, and to work on it. Yes, why not? Why wouldn't Syrians be able to vote and choose who represents them? We can start with those who are abroad, those who can more easily vote, and gradually move. Maybe why not even starting having the refugees in neighboring countries vote, and so on and so forth. So very good idea.
Oh, sorry, my mic was muted. So there is a question by Labid Al-Jundi, who asks how the public sector and bureaucracy expansion served the totalitarian regime in controlling all aspects of Syrians' lives. rather than enforce social equality. Does maybe Samer, would you like to answer to this question? I also have another question directed to Samer and also one to Miriam. So maybe we can start with Samer.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Levi, for the question. I think that you know, the bureaucracy itself was outside, I think, the kind of apparatus of violence that in the way that I think about it, at least. So where was that enacted? That was enacted kind of in the everyday lives of Syrians, of course, the surveillance. It was enacted in the prisons. It was enacted in the actual violence that was inflicted on them. And I think that there's a very important distinction. I mean, maybe Asim wants to talk about this in relation to the idea of the torture state, but I think that there is a distinction to be made between the bureaucracy as a kind of set of institutions and offices and the apparatus of violence. Of course, there's a relationship, but I do think that there's a distinction there to be made.
Thank you, Samer. I also would like to ask you, because you know, the type of work that you do really might be something that many people I know, and from many conversations that we had on the role of capitalism and on market policies in Syria, is something that many might not understand, especially those who haven't lived in Syria before. Syrians who grew up outside the country or others who have never been to Syria before. So there is always this question of the form of capitalism employed in countries like Syria, in countries of the region. And so it might sound a bit of a very oversimplified question, but if you would just, you know, spontaneously respond to what is the difference between capitalism as a system of produce in Syria compared to, for instance, the US, or compared to any other geography that you would like to have a comparison. But yeah, maybe this might help the audience to understand the forms of the forms that capitalism takes in those countries like Syria.
That's a great question. I think that in the interest of time, perhaps the best way to think about it is through the perspective of state capitalism, where there's the continued extraction of surplus from labor, but rather than accumulating principally into the private sector, the extraction benefits the public sector. It's not the case in Syria that it was either a socialist paradise or that the private sector was completely decimated. And I think that's really important in thinking about the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that there remained a Syrian private sector that was heavily repressed, of course, but it remained and was part of the economic landscape in Syria. And so I think that the framework of state capitalism can help us think about the nature of capitalism in Syria. It can also help us think in many ways about what kind of markets the regime was trying to bring into being. We can't divorce any questions of political economy in Syria from the practice of violence, from the ubiquity of violence that was inflicted not just against business people, but against citizens, against workers, against anybody in the population who is deemed potentially subversive. And so there was a process of extraction that was occurring in Syria in the decades preceding the conflict, but it was very much directed by the state and not necessarily by private capital. I think the other important point to make here is that many of the institutions that could advocate for the social protection of labor, for labor rights, I mean, these were all captured by the state. That there really wasn't either kind of autonomous unions or an autonomous private sector for that matter. And I think that really shaped the way in which the relationship between the public and private sector progressed in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Samer. A question to Miriam. I was thinking now throughout the panel about, I mean, you as a social geographer, and it's a discipline that has been, kind of maybe sometimes neglected, especially by other social scientists, regarding political questions, socio-economic questions, socio-political questions. And related to Syria, how do you see this discussion of Yasser Munif has called the geographies of fear, what Samer just said about, a whole discourse of violence? How do you see that related to the question of geography and the way in which the state has used geographical divides in order to, extend and expand division, and how has the state used division and maybe even geographical segregation, if we can call it that, in order to maintain power? I mean, it's a big question again, but I just thought that it's very much related, and maybe you can address that and briefly, because we don't have so much time, but yeah.
So, starting from 2014, the state has managed to receive international UN assistance, food assistance, that was delivered through the port of Latakia. And then it was before the cross-border direct in October 2014, the UN decided not to go through to channel everything, all the assistance by Latakia, but then to do cross-border from Turkey. Okay. But at this moment, you had, of course, several ways to divide the country. First, the Islamic State control, you had 140 silos for wheat, okay? I speak about what I know, I mean, food production, okay? 140 silos. The majority of them they didn't think strategically about that. They were all in Jazeera, and they were controlled by the Islamic State. They managed throughout to sell them some of the production, but anyway. So first, you had to think about new way to import wheat, or to buy wheat from the local producer. So a war starts. In order to move population, as Yassin mentioned, through famine, okay, by hunger, okay. How do? You continue to provide free wheat in the regime-controlled area. To do so, you need money. This money was from Iran, of course, and the wheat would come from Russia, from Ukraine, or bought on the spot, at betting to get the producer from the father. You had that. Now, strategically, to cut the country, of course, we know all the control about the roads, the several M4, M5 roads. Okay, this is another technical point. And the last division has been this possibility of giving free organization to the Kurds, starting from 2013 in the north. But if we come back to food, yes, it was a way to move population, Thank you.
There's a question I can answer, Sarah. So, yeah, of course, I said that the U.S. sanctions, Caesar's law, will aggravate things. But, well, I will not subscribe to the idea that if it were not for the sanctions, things were okay. They were not okay at all. I tried to say that the history of the Assad family in power and the Ba'ath Party is the creation and the ascendance of a new class, very ferocious, very violent, that accumulated its fortune through primitive accumulation, which is violence, mainly violence. That's why torture and genocide and falsicide and destroying popular organization is very important. It is important from why Syria was ruled by a state of exception since 1963, from the very first hour of the Ba'athist rule, because it offers the ideal atmosphere for this class, for the primitive accumulation. This is the main thing that maybe approaches of human rights fail to see. It is a matter of accumulating wealth, and it's a matter of fostering a new class which is ruling the country now in a fascist way. This is the thing. There was another part of the question. Well, what was it? Yeah. So. Well, I don't see any potential, any emancipatory potential of the, and this is what I tried to say in the previous webinar, of the tensions, the possible tensions between American center of power and the regime and its protectors. As for the opposition, well, we don't have, honestly, and yeah, I'm not very proud to say this. Our formal opposition lost any independence and dignity. So the popular masses were left to themselves, and that's why the problem of famine now is even more dangerous. I would say, in general, that the US has made life like hell in the Middle East and in Syria. I would defend at the same time that the main actor in Syria was the Assad regime and its protectors. And so let's just see things in their right sizes. Now Russia is the sovereign power in Syria. And I tend to think even of the struggle between the Assad family and Makhluf family as related to the change of the real sovereign, which is now, it is not the regime, it is not the state, it is Russia. So that's why maybe the issue of money is even more important now for Bashar and his wife and his family, the Assad family. So let's do it. I understand for an American activist, an American leftist, to think that America is sort of divinity that decides everything. This is what Chomsky thinks. I don't agree. I don't agree. For my country, no, the divinity is not the US. That I I say it again, has made life like hell for Palestinians, even for Syrians, and away for Iraqis, for so many. So yeah, I hope I answered the question. I'm not quite sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yassine. I'm jumping in. I was taking care of the streaming and the technical side of the panel, but we unfortunately lost Sarah and lost also Jihad. He's in Lebanon, and there might be a power cut or something else. Sarah is in a mountainous region in Italy, and I think her connection was poor, so apologies for that. Thank you for a very fascinating, very interesting discussion. I think we had a really interesting debate about the political economy in Syria, and you covered different historical phases and answered really interesting questions. Thank you so much for such an inspiring discussion. And I will quickly announce the next panel, which is this Sunday, From Syria to Mexico, the fight for a world without borders, with Omar Dahi, Shinai Ozden, Sana Mustafa, and Justin Akers Shakon. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.